Okay, all right. Good morning, everyone. 8 a.m., security checklist, the most fun way to start the day, right? It's brutal. Hi, I'm Yigal Edry. I'm at NVIDIA today, and with me is?
Brian Kelly.
And, 18 months ago, I was here for the conference, and it was canceled while I was here, and I had to fly back all the way to Israel. So this is really fun that it's actually happening this time. First conference after COVID, I hope. So let's get started. What we want to do today is we want to walk you through the OCP security checklist. And since this is the first talk of the day in the security track, we'll also do some intros. So as I said, I'm Yigal from NVIDIA. Brian is with me from Microsoft. Elaine Palmer, who actually organized this talk for us, ended up not being able to travel. So we will have a virtual Elaine being played at the right sections. And I'll be the DJ for the show. So what we want to do, we want to start by just understanding what is this security project that we've been working on for several years now. Just a quick introduction for those of you who may have not been involved. Who here has been tracking the security work group weeklies? Can you raise your hands? Okay, so we have enough who hasn't, so that would be a good intro. Then we'll talk about the checklist approach for OCP contribution and how the security checklist is fitting into that picture. We'll walk you through the checklist. And we'll also spend time at the end talking about some feedback we've been receiving for around the checklist and what we want to do next and how you can help. So first of all, just background. The OCP security project started, as I said, 3-4 years ago. When did we start it? 2018. I think we were the first to come in and present something, right, and contribute some specs. The idea there was to define how to make platforms, systems, servers that are NIST 800-193 compliant, address the issue of hardware security, protect, detect, and recover. OCP is, not surprisingly, focused on data center equipment. So when we think of the security work, we think of servers, peripherals, any data center equipment, switches, racks, etc. Our focus has been mostly talking on servers, but you can think of the concept that we've been defining as applicable to any data center equipment. And the goal we have really is to try to push the industry forward in terms of hardware security, try to constantly raise the bar. That's what we're trying to do with the work. Just one slide to illustrate how we think of a system in OCP and all of the specs that we've been doing, how they basically map together. So this is just a very, very generic diagram to show that you have a platform, right? And in the platform, you have a CPU, BMC is the additional components. And there are devices, NICs, HBAs, disks, etc. And you always have firmware on both, or most of the time you have firmware on both. So we've been defining this concept of a root of trust. And there are two variants of that. There is the PAROT, the platform active root of trust, the one that sits on the motherboard. And there is an AC active component root of trust, the one that sits on peripherals, on devices. And the specs we've been defining is basically the expected behavior on the device. So like things like secure boot, how does every platform or every device has to do secure boot? And attestation, how does an AC route report back to the platform, to this function of the route on the platform. And attests basically sends security information, trusted measurements to help the platform know that it can trust the device and to help the operator, like the cloud provider or whoever is running the data center, to then get those measurements and know that they can trust the systems. That's really the very high level picture. And as part of that, we've been defining several specs or white papers or guidance, depending on the case, that cover the big picture. This is a new document that's actually a work in progress. The threat model that we are trying to cover how to do secure boot properly, how to do attestation properly. There is ongoing work on how to do recovery. We are discussing things like around ownership transfers. How do you take a system and make it belong to a different entity? And as any good project, we have a backlog, lots of things to do forward. So if you want to come in and contribute, we welcome additional people into the group. We meet every Tuesday, 8 a.m. PST, right? Yep. Yeah. OK. So now let's talk about the checklist and why we're here for. So as we've been doing this, we've also recognized the need to help vendors and customers to know what kind of security you've baked into the system. And as you probably know, in OCP, there is this concept of when you want to submit a system for OCP, you go after a badge of OCP Accepted or OCP Inspired, depending on the level of openness and how much of the specs you are sharing with the community around the system and who you are. So there is an existing system for OCP Accepted and OCP Inspired. So whenever you want to submit a server, you have to go through some process. What's happened in 21, what we did in 21, is that as part of that submission, there is a checklist that every vendor that wants to go after the recognition has to submit. And that checklist basically is covering multiple areas. You describe the product, obviously, but then you also describe what you do around various projects or various initiatives that are happening in OCP. Things like open system firmware, security, hardware management, the BMC. You have to disclose a lot of information about the system that you are applying for to be OCP accepted. And within that checklist, security is there, and that's what we are going to talk about today. From the security perspective, what you need to disclose, what you need to tell the community, or OCP, so that we know what to expect from your system when it comes to security. So why did we do that? I will say now that compliance, we found out that it's a very loaded word. People tend to think of it in different ways. But we wanted to have a goal that there is a common set of requirements, security requirements, that every system should comply with, should deliver, like a common set of features, a common set of properties, some set of information, et cetera. And we want to get that to be a basic expectation, like define the minimum bar for what is considered good and make it like take a formal checklist approach, basically. We also recognize that security, the threat landscape evolves year over year. So we expect this to be evolving as well. So every year, you'll see some different enhancement to the checklist to keep raising the bar and make sure that we continue to be aligned with where the threat landscape is. And the whole idea behind this whole checklist is to help customers make better informed decisions around security of the system that they're purchasing, right? So this is basically coming from vendors saying, hey, this is what we do. These are the features we have. Here is information about our systems. And customers buying OCP systems should be able to look at that and say, OK, this fits my needs or not. In 2021, we are focusing on gathering information. So the first step to that is basically disclosure. We're asking vendors to disclose answers to a set of questions around security about the systems that you're applying for, and basically share that information. There is a badge that you can go after, a security badge. That has been a bit controversial, so we'll be open about this. Not everyone likes those badges. But at the end of the day, the idea here was to recognize the products that are actually secure. So we probably need to find better ways to do the recognition. But right now, there is a badge, and you can choose what badge level you go after. And yes, we're working on feedback. So we'll talk about that at the end. So what is in the checklist? Basically, when we broke down security requirements for a system, we broke it down to a set of sections that we will go briefly over today. And it starts with cryptography. What kind of cryptography you're using in your systems. How do you do the secure provisioning when it comes to identity and unique identities for the systems? You need a strong identity, so you need to ensure that it's provisioned in a secure way. We'll talk about important features such as secure boot, attestation, how do you do firmware updates, recovery. And then this threat assessment, or basically what's your threat model for the system that you're submitting for OCP for acceptance. And about openness, because this is OCP, and openness is important. And it's also important in general for security, right? You can't really trust what you can't see. And in security, we believe that this is even more critical. We've taken all of these requirements and put them into 3 levels. And again, the badge is optional, so you can choose to go for it or not. We basically said there is a very, very minimum bar. If you do a secure boot and attestation, basically, that's a good bronze level. That's a good start. You have 2 core functionalities that are important. The next level after that is additional features like secure update, secure recovery, and also starting to require some additional information. For example, what is your threat model? What are how do you mitigate various threats for hardware? And some source code disclosure. How do you deal with a customer that wants to want to audit your source code, your firmware, how you do that? And gold is kind of like the ultimate maximum. You've implemented everything, all of the features are there, you're fully open, anyone can look at that, open the kimono completely, and that's recognized as gold in today's checklist. So you can also see that this checklist, or the levels, are kind of reflecting completeness of function and openness, and some certification level for the crypto. Okay, so do I have to do this? The answer is yes. If you're submitting a product for OCP Accepted in 2021, you have to fill the checklist. You have some flexibility on what exactly you fill and what badge you're applying for, but this is part of the process. If you have a product coming into OCP, seeking recognition, that is part of the process. For the security part, all you really have to do is fill the checklist. When you go to the OCP webpage and start submitting, you get this checklist. You just have to answer those questions. And you get a choice there to say, hey, and I want a bronze badge because I meet all of the requirements, or I have a gold badge and I meet all of the requirements. It's up to you. So with that, let's start walking through the checklist and get to understand it. It is pretty simple. I have to say that I've seen many people interpreting it in different ways, and I think it was built to actually be pretty simple and straightforward. There are some questions there, or some aspects there that are hard to achieve, but the disclosure about them is also, we think, very valuable. So it starts with what are you certifying? And you basically can certify at OCP one of 2 things. You can certify a motherboard or a platform, or a main board of a system, or you can certify a card like a NIC. If you're certifying a complex system with multiple things in it, then the approach we took here is just like certify each by itself, because it's really complicated to start thinking about the certification of a system with 5 different subsystems, and each of them may have different security properties. So we said, pick one, and if you do that, just like focus on the motherboard or on the card. Then you can pick which badge level you want, and that will be reviewed by OCP as part of the submission. The next section talks about cryptography. So obviously for secure boot, for attestation, for various features of your product from a security perspective, there is cryptography that you're going to use. It's 8 a.m. Come on. Yeah. It's challenging me in the morning. And basically the question here is from basically, yes, I use cryptography that is following the recommendation by NIST. no certification, no formal thing, just I'm using proper cryptography I have my cryptography validated. So I went through the CAVP program, and I have the validation required, which we reward as like this is recognized as silver. Or we actually went through the whole thing of FIPS 100-2 and now 3 certification at a reasonable level. We ask for level 2 and above. I have to say that I think today in the market, most systems are not there, so we expect this to be one of the things that will evolve over time. But we want cryptography to be eventually certified. And then the next thing is secure provisioning. How are you provisioning? Are you doing that in a secure facility? We've seen cases where people do and cases where people don't. And obviously, provisioning strong identities in a secure facility is a very important trait. And this concept of ownership transfer we defined as gold, meaning it's a stretch. We know it's not easy to get to that yet, but it's something that we want to see. So if you do that already, you get extra credits. Secure boot, Brian.
Yeah, I can talk about this. So you forgot to mention that everybody wants a gold badge.
Everyone wants a gold badge, yes.
All right. So secure boot and what is secure boot? This is one of the items on that checklist that Yigal mentioned to get the bronze badge. So you had the bronze, silver, and gold. Secure boot is one of the items for bronze. And for those not familiar with secure boot, it's a mechanism to ensure that authorized or authentic code runs on a device. So when we talk about firmware secure boot, it verifies the integrity of the firmware that runs on the device before it's allowed to execute. So it's important that that verification happens before it executes. So it's very difficult to contain security once that code is executed. So for secure boot to happen, it has to happen early in boot, right before that first mutable code is loaded. There's a digital signature that's typically on the firmware, and that has to be verified before that firmware is ingested and executed. There we go. So why is it important? So as I mentioned, it prevents unauthorized code from booting on a device, and that defends against a raft of attacks. If you can prevent code, malicious code from executing on a device, you can prevent things like attacks on other security mechanisms in the device, ransomware, where some malicious code could load in the device and take control of it. We're talking about the firmware. This executes, on devices below where normal software has visibility to it. It's usually firmware executes at a level that's extremely privileged within these devices, and ensuring that that's authentic is important. Also important, and another aspect on that checklist, is measured boot. And measured boot is critical too. So there's two things that sometimes folks get confused about, and that's measured boot and secure boot. So secure boot is the digital signature verification. So verifying that that code is authentic before it executes. Measured boot is taking a digest of that code and usually hash extending that digest for the next level, but measuring it before it executes. And the two mechanisms are extremely complementary. So measured boot tells you what was actually loaded, and secure boot prevents unauthorized code from loading. So those two mechanisms are very complementary. I always say, if you had people say, hey, if you had to choose one, what would you choose? I would always choose measured boot, because it's better to know what was loaded rather than assume it loaded securely. Okay.
But we want both.
So, well, you want both. You definitely, you want both. But if you had to choose one, it's always better to know what's happened than assume that you're secure. So, secure boot checklist. As I said, it's one to get that bronze badge, and there's a series of steps involved for implementing it correctly. So, the first one is, is it anchored in an immutable source? So if the secure boot mechanism is not anchored in an immutable source, then it can be changed and bypassed and disabled and not very useful if it can be bypassed trivially. And then is the secure boot implemented not only is it anchored in an immutable source, but is it implemented in a way where the first mutable code is being verified? Is the digital signature on the first mutable code being verified by those secure boot keys, whether it's keys or a key chain that's going to get its digital signature verified? Is that happening for that first stage bootloader? And then, of course, is there an anti-rollback mechanism? So with firmware, it's good. We want to make sure that when we implement secure boot, we do it in a manner where it doesn't add brittleness to a system. So do we have a rollback mechanism if we try to do secure boot, and maybe there's an integrity issue with that firmware payload? Do we have a rollback mechanism to go to boot from good code, as opposed to leaving the device in a distressed state where it is difficult to recover? And then, are there error detection parameters on the secure boot? Just like I mentioned, if the secure boot fails, are there parameters for detecting that? Is there a notification that's provided? And then as we get into these are the bronze attributes. As we get into the silver attributes, there's some more advanced features that you can add on top of those, such as are there revocation mechanisms for the secure boot keys themselves? If that key maybe gets compromised over time, the private key for the public key, if that gets compromised, or you need to just change it for good security hygiene, that you're not reusing the same key, then that's considered a slightly more advanced feature. So it's in that silver category. And then the last one in that secure boot checklist is around the number of keys. And when we get into the revocation, you want to have a number of keys where you can repeat that process and change that key. So
okay,
how do I do this?
Time to be a DJ.
Okay. Switch it up.
So now we have a virtual Elaine. It's not just a hybrid event, it's a hybrid session.
Elaine couldn't make it, so she...
Thank you, Yigal. Thank you, Brian. Now we're going to get into the attestation section of the checklist. And before we do, let's go through at least a definition so we're all on the same page. So in attestation, there are two parties. There's an attester and a verifier. The attester is a collection of hardware, software, firmware, and importantly, a root of trust, with the ability to provide reliable evidence of its trustworthiness to a verifier. So let's get into that inside the next slide. So what is evidence and what are measurements? Very simply, the device wants to be added into the platform or the server, and the server wants to admit the devices, assuming they're trustworthy. So the device must report in a trustworthy way what it is, who's the manufacturer, what level of firmware is it running. And the verifier has to has to look at that and examine the information and decide whether or not to let the device in. Now, in the checklist, we have the two sides here as well. So 5.1 section, 5.1, talks about the device, and 5.2 talks about the platform, or the server side. 5.1a and 5.2a are both the same side, or different sides of the same coin, meaning they both have to support the protocol. The device has to support it, the platform has to understand it. Okay. 5.1b says, is the first measurement taken by an immutable root of trust? Meaning, is it read-only memory? Is it hardware? What is it or that takes that very first measurement or records the first thing about the device? And it has to be immutable, meaning it cannot change. 5.1c says, the device, in order to clear the measurements that have been recorded in the device, you must go all the way back to a reset to do that. The reason that's important is because you don't want some other piece of hardware on the bus, you don't want some other piece of software messing around with the measurements and changing them, because then you can conceal mischief and bad measurements that should be recorded and discovered. 5.1d says, are the measurements stored in a place that is protected from modification? And if it is modified, can you detect it? Okay, going into silver now, harder requirements. 5.1e says, if the device has any kind of update or some kind of dynamic change that affects its configuration or its security, can it tell the platform, hey, I've been changed, so I'm not what you think I am anymore? And that's what 5.1 E is for. 5.1F says, does the vendor provide to the customer a list of the things that are measured? What code is measured? Are there keys that are measured? This is outside of the system. In 5.1G, now we're up into gold, and there is a counterpart in the platform side. It says, does the vendor provide what's expected to come out of the device? What kind of measurements should be coming out? What's the level of firmware? What's the hash of the keys? In 5.2b, it's the platform side of that, which says, does the platform support getting one of those manifests and being able to compare that to what the device is providing? And finally, 5.1H says, does the device offer a log of everything that it did as far as measuring, so that the verifier later can have a finer grained examination of all of the evidence provided to it in measurements? Thank you.
Okay. I wish Elaine was here with us. And Elaine, if you're listening, we miss you here. So let's continue. So now I'll walk you through the same slides again. I wouldn't. Okay, so next thing is firmware updates. You'd notice that the questions here are simpler and smaller. That's because the full spec for firmware updates and for recovery are still work in progress. But we still want to have to get the disclosure or basically get the vendors to declare that they are supporting those features. So this is not about expecting the support in a certain way, but do you have secure firmware updates? Really, it's a basic expectation, and we want vendors, when they submit for OCP, to be able to state what they have and then point to the relevant documentation. Again, I think this highlights the fact that this is really supposed to be, if you're doing the right security work, answering those questions shouldn't be rocket science. It should be straightforward disclosure of where you are. And I'd use this opportunity to say one more thing, which is it is all designed as a self-reporting document, right? There is no heavy compliance program behind this. We trust the vendors to be telling the truth about their products. It's an open organization. It's an open ecosystem. It's a lot of it is built on this level of trust. We expect you to say the truth about your products. We think that's a reasonable expectation. So this is just really answering the question in a truthful way, and not a certification program or anything like that. So we're basically asking, hey, do you have support for firmware updates? If yes, please share the documentation, helping customers to choose the right system and get educated on how you do that. And similarly, do you have support for recovery? And if yes, where is it documented? Now we get to the threat assessment. And the threat assessment is really where we try to compile. This is no longer about specific features, but we try to compile a set of questions that will help customers understand what is the threat model that they expect that you've designed the product for, and are you following some good security best practices? But that's really it. So it starts by asking a very trivial question, which is here because there were cases where this was not a yes, where are you shipping the product and there are known CVEs in it? If yes, please tell us, and that's not a good thing, but maybe you have a good reason. And if not, then great. You shouldn't really be shipping products with known vulnerabilities in them that are not patched at the day of release. It's just like best practice, right? There will be security vulnerabilities in the future, for sure. Someone will find something. What's your process for releasing fixes? And again, just point us to how you do that. As a vendor, if there is a security fix coming, how do we make sure that customers get to be aware of it, and do they have the right tooling to deploy the fixes and get back to a healthy state? A basic common expectation, right? The next level of disclosure and openness is if you're willing to share a threat model document that describes your system. So what are the threats? What are your mitigation? What do you do on those different cases? What do you protect against? What you don't claim to protect against? Those are important questions, and there is a template that you can follow for an example template that you can follow for how a threat model can look like. But if you have your own, that's fine. Just point us to the document where this is done. And if you're following an SDL, a secure development lifecycle, what is it? Do you have it documented somewhere? Some companies do, some companies don't. If you do have it, it's goodness, because it helps customers know that they can trust your secure development processes and expect less security issues from such products. The next checklist, or the next section, is about openness. And here it's really about access to the firmware source code, and specifically to the security and sensitive features that we've been talking about. People have different implementations of secure boot, of attestation. If that's open, it means the community can scrutinize that and find and help report issues. And we believe that generally increases the security posture. There is always this tension between, if I open up too much, then I risk also the bad people looking at my code and finding those issues. But I can tell you from the 20 more years of dealing with security, if you believe that being closed helps you be more secure, You haven't seen hackers do reverse engineering, really. There is nothing they can't reverse engineer. So it's better to be open and show the code and help and get the community help in reviewing that and improving the security of your code than thinking that if I hide my code, no one will know about the issues. So we prefer openness as a security property. You wanted to say something about that, right?
No, yeah, I fully agree.
Yeah.
Security by obscurity doesn't work.
Yeah, yeah. We've had like tons of discussions with OCP around encryption of the flash, and is it security or is it IP protection, right? So as IP protection, absolutely, that's fine. It's not security, that's my personal opinion. Anyway, so just to recap, we've gone through the checklist. The checklist is mandatory. You have to fill it. It's not mandatory to answer yes for everything, but you have to fill it if you want to get accepted or inspired badge. And if there are questions there that you don't feel comfortable answering, that's fine. But try to answer as much as you can, and obviously truthfully. And as I think you've seen, it's not that complicated. It's not a very heavy checklist. If you've been building the right features, it's a 30-minute exercise for the right person. It's not a long, complicated process. So all we want is that when a product is appearing on the OCP marketplace as accepted or as inspired, there is this list somewhere that customers can go and look at and understand, okay, these are the answers to this product, and now I can judge whether it fits my need or not. Okay, so what's beyond 2021? So we have been getting a lot of feedback, and Elaine has been coordinating the work around that feedback. So we will trigger virtual Elaine back again and let her walk you through the feedback we've been receiving and what we're doing about it. Hello, Elaine.
Hi, I'm back again. It's time to tell you about what's happening. I'm working on the next checklist for the future. So once the current 2021 checklist was published and approved, then we started getting some feedback on it. And that's exactly what we wanted. We wanted feedback. So it varied. You can see some of the comments.
You don't see it, right?
It's not on the screen.
I have to go out of presentation mode.
You can see that.
Yeah.
That we got. We don't need no stinking badges because everybody wants gold. Vendors were concerned that by filling out the checklist, they would be revealing some vulnerabilities in their products. The time horizon was too short because product pipelines can be 2 to 3 years, if not more, when the hardware is involved. So what we decided to do was to take these comments into consideration and start working on what the next checklist should be. One of the questions, though, looking at number 8, that was, should this checklist be required? Should it be informational? Should it be something that customers can take to their vendors and say, hey, I want 5.2c? How should it work? So it's still a work in progress. This is a working draft of the next checklist. It will most definitely change. We have changed many of the sections as listed here. We still don't know whether these should be suggestions or requirements. And those discussions are taking place in the security project meetings. So if you would like to get involved in working on the next checklist, we would love to have your input too. So here are ways to get involved. You can join our mailing list. You can join our calls and put in your 2 cents. We'd love for you to share use cases It's been really helpful to have real live examples of what products can and cannot do. And we also do publish white papers on the topic. So this is in the slides, and you can please join us if you feel so inclined. Thank you.
Thank you, Elaine. So let me just go back to the deck and say one more thing. Yeah, okay. So I would say one more thing in addition to what Elaine said about the call to action, and then we'll open up for questions. One thing that I think is we can have more of at the security work group is more of the customer side of things coming into the providing feedback into the checklist. We have a lot of vendors working together to define the checklist, but it's kind of like we think we know what the good security is, and we'll define the list. We have the major cloud providers, obviously, like Microsoft, Facebook, Google, also active there. But at the end of the day, this checklist is meant to help customers choose the right product. So we would love to have more. If you're on the side of the customer buying OCP equipment, we would love to have more of your contribution and thoughts on what is helpful for you as input into this process. So join our calls if you can. And with that said, we'll open up for questions. So that's all we had to say. Thank you. Hey.
I'm on the more of the design. Yep. Yoni, Western Digital. So I'm on the side, device side of the platform. So a couple of things that I've been attending the security, but just to make sure and to outline that. First, it's so cannot. Okay. So just to make it clear, it is more of a list of what's and not on how you do it. And the question is there a reference or somewhere that their how is being outlined, or is only on the company who fills that form to decide how the house goes, and not the. Okay. So this is first question. Second, and again, to make clear, the list of the badge, the bronze, for example, failing to fill each item with yes prevents you to get the badge. That's for sure. Mm-hmm. And second, as higher you go with the badge, it means you need to fulfill all the below checklist. Yeah. So that's another clarification, right?
Okay. Yeah. So first of all, on the how versus what, you are absolutely correct that we are focusing on the what. It can be an interesting discussion, but I think that generally what we want to do here is set a bar for having the right security properties, not how we implemented them. Yeah. So it's on purpose. We don't want to dictate a single implementation. There are open source codes available that you can use to get inspired of the how. Before I joined NVIDIA, I was working at Chameleon. We actually took the open source code for Cerberus and implemented a root of trust. And we kind of got a lot of the how as a free gift from Microsoft, right? But in OCP, we don't want to dictate, hey, you have to do that. We want to say those are the features you need to have and the properties you need to have. So it's a what on purpose.
And there's specifications
which I support.
to help guide it.
I don't want to go to the house, but just to make it clear that we are only dealing with what.
Yeah, we are dealing with what. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. And under our documents, like the white papers or specifications on the secure boot component attestation that describe in detail, they describe how you go about an implementation. They don't precisely provide that implementation.
It's a guideline.
But, yeah. Mm-hmm. But for example, like for attestation, there is a definition of a protocol and an expected flow. And you want that because you want systems to be interoperable at the end and also to implement it correctly. But if you prefer to implement attestation with whatever implementation you want, that's totally fine as long as you follow this
Guideline.
Yeah.
But
then you fail with the first
Oh,
item on the attestation checklist. I think I don't remember if it says OCP attestation or attestation in general.
we can look at it, but you're not supposed to fail. You're not supposed to fail if you implemented something that is following the guidelines.
I think as is today, it says OCP attestation and maybe one.
So we'll look at that if there was something like that there. I think that's where, like, English is a non-formal language, and sometimes you describe things and you mean one thing, and people have been brutally trying to interpret it in the other way. So if we made mistakes, we'll fix them. Okay. The second question or the second point you made was about it's almost like all or nothing, right? You have to answer yes to all of the bronze questions to be able to be bronze, and you have to answer yes to all of the gold questions to be able to be gold. I think, first of all, right now, this is indeed the case. I think it's pretty easy to answer yes to all of the bronze questions today with any reasonable security product. Silver and gold, it becomes harder, for sure. And the intention here was to try to raise the bar. Having said that, we are getting feedback that says this is too hard, and no one likes to be less than gold, including NVIDIA. Right? Therefore, we are looking at ways to improve the approach. What we are looking for is to find a way to still recognize good security and give you the credit if you've done a good job, right? But not make it impossible to achieve. So that's why we really welcome people coming into the group and helping us define an improved list for the future that will be, recognizing the right things, making something maybe optional. We're starting.
There's no way to acknowledge a bronze plus. I mean, being some gold.
Shinier
well,
ones.
you can. There is no formal way to recognize bronze plus, but the checklist is available to customers, so you can talk about that, right?
Yeah. At the end, it's an.
At the end, it's an open thing. It's a checklist that you've published, and you can say in your marketing collateral, I have OCP bronze, but I also do ownership transfers, whatever, right? You can do that.
Okay.
Okay.
Thanks.
But thinking about just what you said, would you prefer a score to a bronze, silver, and gold? How would you solve that? Or what would your recommendation be? Would you prefer a score?
Maybe a score, but then the question is scoring system. What is more valuable points-wise?
But then everyone will want a 10, right?
Everyone
so
wants a high
if
credit
I'm not
score.
10, I'm not doing it. So we need to find a way that helps everyone feel comfortable and helps the customer see which products have done, a good job that fits their needs. And that's why we've started looking at, there is a timeline involved. You've seen the draft checklist. Not everything is required today. Some things will take until 2024, 2025. That's fine. We'll set a direction. There are discussions on how to identify which questions in the checklist are always critical and which ones may be not really necessary everywhere. And we'll improve. And the 2022 checklist should be better.
Yeah.
Okay.
Thanks.
Thank you. I think we got some questions here.
Yeah, sorry. So it goes back to the first question. If you don't define the how, don't you fear that it might crumble actually? Because let's say you have, as a threat model, you have somebody's at attack. Let's say that all the security is done by the management core. And let's say somebody attacked that management core, then it can masquerade itself and pretend to be all OCP compliant and all checklist, but it's still a rogue firmware.
So if we don't say how to do secure boot properly, you're worried that someone will say, I do secure boot, that it will be a compromise mechanism?
It depends on how it's done, but like if it's a management core that does all that and communicate to the outside world and report all the OCP, or I'm signed, or this is my root of trust, and so on and so forth. And if somebody managed to compromise that core, then at one point it might actually also masquerade as a very OCP compliant and still pretend to be the genuine firmware, while it's not.
So for that, there are documents on that kind of how. So I think the question on the how to be, do you give a specific implementation? So there are documents or guidelines on attestation, component attestation, secure boot, recovery, and firmware update.
And actually, there is another doc that I think I forgot to list, which is best practices on how to develop secure firmware. there is one, right? It's a whole checklist by itself. And if you follow those guidelines, you reduce the chances of having compromised implementations. Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
All right, thank you. I think we got one more.
Have time? Do you have
Hey,
time?
Majid.
Hi. So, you know, I kind of feel there's a little of a chicken and egg problem here. It's kind of typical vendors don't want to do because standard doesn't exist and standard, you know, doesn't have adoption because vendor, you know. So one experience that I have positive in the past is that NIST has a sort of a nice feedback loop sometime. You can maybe feed back to NIST and maybe raise the bar on NIST. Have you guys thought about that?
We have actually had sessions with people from NIST joining in and exchanging thoughts on directions and asking for feedback and giving feedback. There was even a doc where we gave feedback to NIST on some draft doc that they were doing. So yes, we do that from time to time. We engage with other standards body, NIST, DCG, and provide feedback to them. Feedback to us, I think we're always trying to do that. So.
Yeah. So like my impression was, I don't know the NIST standards in this area, in firmware and hardware, but my impression was that's where maybe you started and you went farther, right? So maybe one suggestion, I know this is difficult, but one suggestion is to go back to NIST and say, hey, we're a little bit further along. You know, sometimes they do special studies. You know, they write special papers and stuff like that. I have helped NIST in the past with those type of things. Yep. And I mean, NIST is very prevalent, so that's kind of a suggestion.
Yeah, thanks. It's a good suggestion. You can actually watch one in the November summit. We did a session together with various industry, like standardization bodies, discussing how we can better collaborate. So, but we can definitely do more of that, yes. In last November, I think. Any more questions? Okay, thank you very much.